Thank you for joining us. Happy Tuesday. Hope you're doing well. I know we just came off of a long weekend, so you should be, in theory, extra refreshed today and ready to go. So we're ready to go here. I am so honored to be here. My name, for those who don't know me, I'm Michelle. I'm joining from Amiskwaci, Waskaga, Treaty 6 territory, Edmonton. Let us know in the chat box where you're joining from. We're so glad that you are here. And listen, I am super excited for today's session with Miranda Kennedy. So she's going to talk about cultural awareness. And I don't know if you're probably here, you probably read the little info session about today, what she's going to talk about. And as I read it, I was really excited. I'm really looking forward to having her join us. But in a moment, I always love to just take a moment to press pause in your day, extend that gratitude, give thanks to Creator, give thanks for this beautiful world that we're part of, this land, the sacred waters, all of the medicines, all of the good resources that are around us that help us to walk in a good way. So we just give thanks for this moment, for this day, the breath in our lungs, the family that's around us, whether that's your chosen family or not. You're surrounded by goodness and love because you live in Creator's world. So welcome, welcome. So a little bit today about our guest speaker. There will be opportunity at the end for any questions that you might have or comments. So feel free also to put them in the chat box. Utilize that throughout today's session as well. I will be sure to make note of them. All right, so our guest speaker is a proud member of the Little Pine First Nation in Saskatchewan. Her Cree, oh gosh, Miranda, you're gonna have to when you're up, you're gonna have to tell us your Cree name. I don't want to break it right now. The one word that makes sense to me right now is squeo. I'm gonna say sky woman.
Pasni Apiusko.
Oh, beautiful. I love hearing our language. It's a beauty, which means, oh, there it is. Woman who sits with the rocks. So she attended University of Saskatchewan, holds a Bachelor of Commerce degree in Human Resource Management, and she has over 20 years of combined experience in social work, human resources, and project management. Her upbeat attitude, great communication skills, and extensive background in handling complex issues makes her a valuable resource for First Nations communities. So we are so lucky, we're so blessed, so honored to have you here to share your good knowledge. I feel like this is a tobacco. We need to give you some tobacco because I really believe the knowledge that you're going to bring is really sacred and really important. And it's probably some of those teachings that have been around since the beginning, as we think about our ancestors who walk these lands for thousands of years. So we just honor what you bring to the table today. We come with an open mind and an open heart, and we welcome you to this virtual circle, Miranda, and I'm passing this virtual mic off to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Danse, hello, everybody. Like she was saying, my name is Miranda Kennedy. I'm from Treaty 6, Little Pine First Nation. I'm actually a fluent Cree speaker. And I was raised by my grandparents. So a lot of my cultural knowledge come from two mushrooms I have. The late Eli Bear from Little Pine, who was a chief at one time, briefly. And then he was, he was an MC. Everybody actually knows him as a master of ceremonies. So at powwow. So he actually mentored a lot of our current MCs on how to MC powwows. And he also later in life became an elder for the community and did a lot of ceremonies, right? So, and I also was mentored by my uncle, Walter Bones. He's also from Little Pine, and he was mentored by my grandfather. So I had mentors in my life that taught me a lot about my culture. So I want to give thanks to them. Anything that I know and speak about comes from there. Okay, so I want to start by talking about cultural awareness. I think that everybody should, as an Indigenous person, feel proud of who they are, where they come from. And if you're not, and if you don't know those teachings, I encourage you to get to know history and get to know where you come from and why things are the way they are and how we actively are working as communities to better our lives since, history. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to give you a snapshot of what cultural awareness is, and then I'm going to encourage you to learn more as you go along, okay? All right, let's begin. So first of all, what is cultural awareness? Cultural awareness is about knowing who you are, the relationship that we have with one another, our spirituality, our connection to the land, its inhabitants, and our connection to Creator. The philosophy of Native spirituality is to understand our belongingness to Mother Earth and knowing about the gifts that the Creator provides us, from medicines to food, so that we are able to look after ourselves and our loved ones. I urge you to seek out and learn about your own culture and spirituality, as our protocols vary from nation to nation. So why is culture important? Identity and culture go hand in hand. It is essentially the foundation of who we are as a people. We tend to ask these basic questions when we meet. Where does that person come from? Who is their family? Because a lot of us relate to each other through kinship ties, right? Cultural identity is an important component for the overall well-being of any person. It is how we relate to one another, and it's also including survival, right? So culture awareness is so important. And just recently, I was telling one of the ladies that I was working at one of the Indigenous, they weren't Indigenous here, but they're actually from India. And so they describe themselves as Indian, right? So when I was trying to explain who I was, they said, but we're Indians, right? Columbus discovered us, right? So I had to compare and contrast that we were actually First Nations from Canada here. And so they got that because they don't like being called East Indians. They like to say they're Indians. So I had to give them, that explanation of who we are, right? So when we talk about creation stories, Indigenous nations tell their own stories about the origins of the world and their place in it. It is estimated that 200 million First Nations people, we were also called Indians that time, and Inuit were living in what is now Canada when the Europeans began to settle here in the 16th century. For 200 years, the Indigenous population declined, largely as a result of European territorial encroachment and diseases, right? So you're going to learn that in school. And there's two different stories, right? They have their storybooks and so do ours. A lot of us we tell it through oral stories, right? So the timeline that I will be presenting will highlight key events and developments in Indigenous history from time immemorial to present day. The information provides a broad chronicle overview to help support educators and students as yourselves, right? So it's just a summarized, the information that I'm providing is a summary, right? But like I said, you're going to have to do more research. I do a lot of research. I try to get to know myself and my people and the history. I read, right? But that's what I'm saying. We're just going to discuss highlights of what happened. Cool. Okay, so Indigenous people of Canada. All First Nations believe that their values and traditions are gifts from the Creator. Land is viewed as sacred, and Indigenous people recognize themselves as the original stewards of the land. One of the most important and most common teachings amongst the people is that one should live in harmony with the natural world and all it inhabited. Before the arrival of the Europeans, First Nations were able to satisfy all their material and spiritual needs through the resources of the natural world around them. All First Nations across the country hunted and gathered plants for both food and medicinal purposes. The actual percentage of meat, fish, and plants in any First Nations diet depended on what was available in the local environment. Elders passed along oral stories and legends that from one generation to another, First Nations children learned how the world began or came into being, and that they were a part of the world of creation. People had give thanks to everything in nature upon which they depended for survival and development as individuals and as members of their communities. First Nations treated all objects in their environment, whether inanimate or animate, with the utmost respect. This deep respect that First Nations cultivated for everything and every process in the natural world was reflected in songs, dances, and ceremonies. The principles that guided day-to-day conduct, many First Nations shared value systems similar to the seven grandfather teachings. These teachings stressed wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth as the values that enable people to live in a way that promotes harmony and balance with everyone and everything in creation. So fast forward with the arrival of the Europeans in the 16th and 17th century. When the Europeans arrived, they began colonizing North America through wars and land takeovers from the indigenous nations. This had and still has a very significant impact in our way of life today. Nations in Canada and US tribes were all affected by colonialism. Settlers came and wanted land as it was viewed as an economic asset, right? So before then and to now, these were things that happened, right? So, and we're aware of that, right? We're also aware of the reserve system. Some of you may or may not be aware, but there was a reserve system. It's important to know this because First Nations people were not consulted when reserves were created. They did not give consent. They were not compensated either for the lands that were taken from them. Since their creation, reserve land was reduced in size and resources were taken, all without compensation. Until as recently as 1958, people living on reserve needed written permission from the Indian agent in order to leave the reserve for any reason. So that's another important aspect of our history that you need to know. And then moving on, we talk about treaties, right? So after all of that happened with the land, people being put into reserves, we also talk about treaties in Canada and why are they important? Indigenous treaties in Canada are constitutionally recognized agreements between the Crown and Indigenous peoples. Most of these agreements describe exchanges where Indigenous nations agreed to share some of their interest in their ancestral lands in return for various payments and promises. Treaties have been used to end wars, settle land disputes, and even used to establish new countries. Treaties in Canada date back to the time when Europeans first arrived in America. Europeans sought to make alliances with Indigenous peoples as a way of maintaining the peace, providing access to natural resources, and gaining alliances in trade and colonial wars, right? So it's important to know about the treaties, right? Do your research. This is some of the information that I learned about treaties, right? There was a number of different types of treaties through history. So if you look at this timeline, there was a peace and neutrality treaty from the 1701 to 1706. Right after that was peace and friendship treaties from 1725 to 1779. So there was not just ours, there was many others. Upper Canada land surrenders and the Williams treaties happened in 1767 to 1862 and even right up to 1923. And then the one that we're most familiar with is the Robinson Treaties and the Douglas Treaties of 1850 and 1854. So these are all the treaties that happened throughout history. And so the Robinson Treaties of 1850 to 1854 was named after a gentleman named William Benjamin Robinson, a former fur trader from the Muskokas who was tasked with buying up as much land as possible in the Upper Lakes watershed, including the north shore of Lake Huron and the eastern shore of Lake Superior. This treaty is a government-to-government document that was signed between First Nation leaders and the British Crown with an agreement to share land and resources. The First Nations in the treaty territory did not surrender their land, but agreed to share it in exchange for an annual payment from any resource revenue in the territory. The need to develop treaties in the upper Great Lakes was driven by the need for new lands for agriculture settlement and the growing interest from mining companies to explore the lands of the upper Great Lakes for possible mineral deposits. So let's talk a little bit more about the Robinson Treaties. The differences between the Robinson Treaties and the preceding ones we just talked about that were negotiated in Upper Canada is that instead of negotiating for small parcels of land, the Robinson Treaties involved the surrender of huge tracts of land with different Indigenous groups. Annuity payments were negotiated of cash going to individual band members. Other terms negotiated were the settling of reserve lands for each individual signing group, as well as hunting and fishing rights throughout the treaty territory, so as long as there's no mining and resource development or settlement. The Robinson Treaties were the first treaties to bundle all these elements together effectively, becoming the model upon which subsequent treaties were negotiated. So if you look at this map, there's 11 numbered treaties, right? These were all the treaties that resulted from the Robinson Treaties. So taking the form established by 1850, the Robinson Treaties, the Crown negotiated 11 treaties between 1871 and 1921. In Western Canada, numbered treaties from 1 to 11 are a series of historic post-Confederation treaties that were made in rapid succession over a short period of time between First Nations people and the Crown, which is now called Canada, right? The treaties opened the West for settlement. They also secured a connection between British Columbia and Central Canada. The numbered treaties were used to assimilate Indigenous peoples into Canadian society. The government wanted Indigenous peoples to adopt the values and behaviors of white settlers. The Government of Canada recognizes 70 historic treaties in Canada signed between 1701 and 1923. So there's a number of historic treaties, not just the 11 that we are familiar with. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Department in Indian Affairs. So as a response to the growing colonial conflict with the French and British officials, there was a department called the Indian and Northern Affairs in 1955. It was established to manage the military relationship between the colonial officials and their Indigenous allies. The department's original mandate was to promote Western settlement under the Dominion lands policy. Among other strategies, this involved negotiating treaties with Indigenous peoples in the prairies for access to their territories for settlement and development purposes. So after Confederation, the British, who had created the first Indigenous department in 1755, transferred this responsibility to the Canadian government. Since then, different departments have been responsible for the portfolios of Indigenous and Northern affairs. There are currently 2 departments overseeing Indigenous affairs. That's Indigenous Service Canada, and it's concerned with providing and supporting the delivery of services, including healthcare, childcare, and education to Indigenous communities. There's also the Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada that oversees Indigenous government relations, such as matters pertaining to treaty rights and self-government and the concerns of Northern communities. So from the Department of Indian Affairs came into effect was the Indian Act. The act was passed by the Parliament of Canada under the provisions of Section 9124 of the Constitution of 1867, which provides Canada's federal government exclusive authority to govern in relation to Indians and land reserved for Indians. The Indian Act of 1876 granted the Canadian government control over many aspects of Indigenous peoples' lives, including the management of housing, health services, the environment, and other resources on reserve. This act enabled the government to remove Indigenous people from areas the newcomers desired to settle or develop. The cultural practices and processes of Indigenous people were relentlessly eroded and almost extinguished by the policies of marginalization, assimilation, and oppression. The Indian Act was created to assimilate Indigenous peoples into mainstream society and contained policies intended to terminate the cultural, social, economic, and political distinctiveness of Indigenous peoples. The Indian Act banned ceremonies such as the potlatch, ghost dance, Sundance, and more. People were arrested for performing them, and their ceremonial materials were taken away by the government. Effects of this prohibition are still felt today. So part of the Indian Act was the residential school, right? So that was another tactic that the government used to assimilate all our people. Children were removed from their homes and communities, removed from any and all influences related to who they were as Indigenous people. And the motto was kill the Indian in the child. They wanted to civilize the Indians. This began in 1880s, and then right up to 1920, it became mandatory, for Native children to go into residential school. Parents would be incarcerated if children did not attend. So in 1820, under the Indian Act, it became mandatory for every Indigenous child to attend a residential school and illegal for them to attend any other educational institution. So what happened in these schools? The children's hair were cut short. They cut off all their braids. They were had to wear uniforms, not able to speak their language. They were physically, mentally, spiritually, and sexually abused at these institutions. Siblings were not allowed to interact with each other at all. Poor education, diet, and health were evident in these schools. Unsanitary environments. There was overcrowding happening in these schools, and 1 in 32 of these students died while they were there. And they compared it to the Vietnam War. That's how atrocious it was. So fast forward, now we have, march and protest against these situations that happened in history. That's why we have this movement now called Every Child Matters. 1 year after the unmarked graves of 215 Indigenous children were found in Kamloops. So there was people, elders, that actually shared that these things were happening, that children were one day there and not there, and people said they're being buried, and people were actually telling them these children are being buried in these schools, and nobody was listening to them. Right, but they were there. The numbers from Kamloops were originally reported at 215, and then the numbers began to climb as more unmarked graves were found at former residential schools. It is very important that people understand the difficult journey these survivors and communities must make in order to find justice and healing. So lots of things happened to our people. Our ancestors overcame many, many challenges. And a lot of our people aren't aware. They wonder why things are the way they are. Why was I in care? Why don't I know my language? How come I don't know my culture? So when they start talking and researching, they're going to discover a lot of these stuff happened to their families and people before them, right? So that wasn't the only thing that happened to our people. I actually have a friend who was part of the 60s group, actually two of them. So when their mothers had them in the hospital, those children were actually adopted out, pretty much sold to non-Indigenous people. And so they were raised by those families. The next oppressive policy that targeted our children was the 60s scoop. These children were removed from their homes and families. They were fostered and adopted out to white families. Some children never came home. Some children didn't come home until they were adults, right? And then they were repatriated after that. Some people do not know that they have Aboriginal heritage, right? That was never shared with them. They don't know. But the people who do, like my two friends, one of them is from Saddle Lake, right? So she got to know her mom. Her mom shared that story. No, I didn't give you away. You were taken away right from birth, right from the hospital. It was the doctors and nurses who decided that this was going to happen. It was against her will, right? And then I have another friend from Port Chip. He was raised in the States. He went over there, and then he came home, and when he turned 18 and got to know his family in Port Chip. So that's where he's from, right? So And he's so smart that he learned Dene and Cree. That's both his parents have that Dene and Cree background. So when he got to know his family, he had this accent, Philly accent, because that's where he was raised. Fast forward, that accent's not there. And he amazes me because he can speak Cree and Dene. So he was really trying hard to know who he was, what language he spoke. And fast forward, he knows English, Cree, and Dene. He just amazes me. So the 60s scoop refers to the large-scale removal of scooping of Indigenous children from their homes, communities, and families have birthed through the 1960s and their subsequent adoption into predominantly non-Indigenous middle-class families across the United States and Canada. This experience left many adoptees with a loss of sense of cultural identity. The physical and emotional separation from their birth families continues to affect adult adoptees and Indigenous communities to this day. There's an organization that you need to be familiar with, and it's called UNDRIP. And you're probably saying, UNDRIP, what's that? A lot of people aren't aware of UNDRIP. UNDRIP, its headquarters is in New York City. So every year or so, all the Indigenous groups around the world congregate and they talk about their collective human rights, right? UNDRIP stands for United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So UNDRIP Act was established a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the Indigenous peoples of the world. It elaborates on existing human rights standards and fundamental freedoms as they applied to the specific situations of Indigenous people. So when they congregate each year, they discover a lot about themselves, the differences and similarities of what they went through as Indigenous people, right? And so they develop policies, through their involvement collectively and say, these are our needs. This is what we need as Indigenous people. So they developed a framework, and there's a number of different wants and needs that they laid out. If you go in and look at UNDRIP, there's a number of different lists or needs that this act provides. It really provides a roadmap for the government of Canada and the First Nations, Inuit, Métis people on how to work together to implement the UN Declaration. Yeah, it's a number of declarations, right? There's over 30. There's a list of them. If you go into Google, you'll read them. There's a number of declarations that they developed, these people, all the Indigenous people around the world, saying this is what we need. And so when they talk about their collective rights, it's really about their human rights, right? So the UN Declaration based on lasting reconciliation, healing, and cooperative relations. The act became law June 21st of 2021. Under the act, the Government of Canada will work in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples to take all measures necessary to ensure the laws of Canada are consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And it also speaks to preparing and implementing an action plan to achieve the objectives of the UN Declaration, right? So These are a number of acts that speak to what it is as a collective they want based on their human rights, right? That they want the government to adhere to. And one of them is that duty to consult with First Nations before they make decisions, because their decisions affect them. And I've just told you how they took over, made these rules, and a lot, and took the land and never consulted with them, right? So this UNDRIP is a way for them to say collectively, right, as they're united and they're stronger together, right? So they speak with the government, and they advocate for our collective rights. So when you think about today, the current statistics, there are 634 First Nations in Canada. And I just talked about 11 number treaties, right? These are things you need to know. I'll talk about statistics that I had in 2016 and then fast forward today. So in 2016, there was over 1.6 million Aboriginal people in Canada, and 4.9% of the overall population if you compare them to other groups. First Nations back then was, over 900,000 people. Métis, close to 600,000. Inuit, 65,000. And we're considered the fastest growing population in Canada. And if you look at the US, right, we have more First Nations in Canada than they do. So in the Native American tribes, right, there's 562 tribes, right, in the US. So in the 2021 consensus accounts for 1.8 million Indigenous people currently, accounting for 5% of the total population in Canada, which was up from 4.9% in 2016. So there's 624,000 Métis living in Canada, up 6.3% from 2016. And there's now over 70,000 Inuit in Canada, just over 2/3 living in Inuit Nunavut, the homeland of Inuit in Canada. So the Indigenous population living in large urban centers has grown, right? So most of our people are living in the urban centers as compared to on reserve. So when you think about our communities, nation to nations, there's community protocols that we need to be aware of, and they vary. So basically, consent should always be the focus. Be respectful when you're engaging with the community, especially the leadership. Do not judge or talk about people, right? Because that's something none of them appreciate, right? Use plain English, not big fancy words when you're visiting that community. Be truthful and honest. And then if you're making deals with the nations, you have to honor all agreements and understand that communities' matters can change in an instant as issues may arise. For example, if there's a death in the community, that's priority. They're going to shut offices down. Nobody's going to be working. And you may be wondering, well, what happened? I had an appointment today. I was supposed to meet with so-and-so. And next thing you know, the offices are closed. So these are some of the community protocols that you have to be aware of, right? The school could be closed, the band office could be closed, especially if there's a an elder who's passed on in the community. And be willing to have a flexible schedule, right? Sorry about that. I'm starting to have a dry throat. So, in order to have effective Indigenous engagement, these are some of the things that you need to be aware of. So, number one, learning about the nation that you're visiting, right? What treaty territory do they live? Are they located in a remote community or near the city? Is it a large community? What business do they own? Even for us as our company, Okamau Community and HR Solutions, we work with all the First Nations in Canada. We also have to do our homework. When we're engaging with different First Nations, we also have to know their treaty territory, their leaders, whether they're a have community, have not. You always have to know the people that you're going to be doing businesses with. Number two, understanding the community as a whole. What is their language that they speak? Who are their families? And some of them have a clan system, right? So for me, in my community, my relatives would be the Bears, right? And then on the other side would be the Franks, right? On my dad's side, my mom's side, the Bears, and then my in-laws would be the Kennedys, right? So knowing, what language you speak and the family ties is very, very important, right? Because you don't want to go there and be talking about people because they're all related. We're all related over there, right? Three, learn about their governance structure. Who makes the decisions in the community, right? Because sometimes it's the chief, sometimes it's a counselor, not the chief. Sometimes it's the elders council that makes all those decisions, right? So you have to get to know who actually makes the decisions. Four, always include elders in the conversation or meeting, right? So any meeting that you are involved in or going to, especially in our community, you're going to see that elders are sitting there. The elders are there to as guides, right? And they also open and close the meetings. So there's a cultural protocol there, right? So you'll see that happening. So what the question is I have is, what is the protocol or customs in your community, right? Do you know them? And if you don't, find out, get to know what is the practice over there. Because even for me, I live in the city, but when I go to my community, if I'm going to have a feast or attend any kind of function, I always have to ask because sometimes family have a certain way of doing things, even though we may be from the same community. So I will ask, what is it they would like me to bring? Or is there anything that I need to be aware of, if I go there, right? So there could be community protocols and family protocols, right? So find those things out. So how do we move forward? How do we move past historical wrongs to create a new path forward that benefits us all? Despite the persistence of colonial obstacles, community leaders are rebuilding their nations in ways that honor their unique customs and culture, while allowing their members to fully participate in and benefit from modern day economies. This economic shift in Indigenous communities is about more than prosperity, it's about dignity. So for me, I work on partnership building, right? So partnership building is a way to invest and encourage industry, to work with our nations so that we can transition back into self-government and self-sufficiency, right? So partnership building can be a win-win situation if both parties, work together, and it's meaningful, long-term, trusting relationships, right? Because they've always needed us in the past. Well, we need them fast forward. We need to work together. We need to create those alliances to get ourselves out of poverty, right? So we need those educated, business-minded, forward-thinking people to create these opportunities, these partnerships that are going to help our communities. So nation rebuilding outcomes, includes things such as recognition and reconciliation, right? Reconciliation is a buzzword nowadays, right? Healthy life on land is another one that we strive for. Healthy air, cultural and linguistic vibrancy, right? We all want cultural awareness. We all want to be able to learn to speak our language. Peace, justice, and strong institutions. That's what we desire. Social and economic vibrancy is another one. Food security, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean air and sanitation, affordable housing, reliable transportation, affordable and clean energy, meaningful work and growth, sustainable development, responsible consumption and production, industrial and economic innovation, and accessible infrastructure, and on and on. There's all these possibilities that can happen through partnership development, right? Because we know and we understand that we can't do it alone, right? But we need those partnerships, long-term partnerships, trusting relationships, have to happen in order for us to thrive and succeed. And so through my research, there's a common theme in the Indigenous communities. We have this collective vision, and that vision is to have a vibrant, healthy community, speaking our language, governing effectively, and maximizing our lands and resources for the benefit of all living things and future generations in a manner consistent with our values and principles. This is what my research, by talking to people, this is what we're saying. This is what we want, right? And we need to share that knowledge with our young people, with the generations to come, so that they benefit, that they have a brighter future than what we have today. And then there was this research, as I was doing my research, I came across this. This was from Justin Trudeau. He's the current prime minister with the government, and he talked about restructuring. So in 2017, the government of Justin Trudeau implemented a recommendation of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples by dissolving Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, that we call INAC, and replacing it with two government departments, which happened, right? We have the Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs and Indigenous Service Canada. He did do that. Indigenous Service Canada works toward improving the quality of services delivered to Indigenous peoples, with the eventual goal of having these services delivered by Indigenous nations rather than the Crown. This is what he's proposing. This new department will absorb the First Nations and Inuit Health branch from Health Canada. The federal government described the restructuring of INAC as the next step forward to abolishing the Indian Act. So this is what I discovered through my findings. And I encourage you to keep researching yourself and learning about how the government has changed, and if they did, and how, us too, we need to educate ourselves, and how we can negotiate and work with our current governments, right? And so I encourage you to do that. But I'm going to leave you with this, right? And you can ask questions after, but there's this video that I wanted to show you. It really gave me goosebumps, and I was really proud. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to share this today, because I think a lot of times people feel underappreciated and don't feel like, proud. But for me, I'm a proud Indigenous Nehusko. I'm proud of our people. We overcame so many challenges. We're still here. We're still in Canada. And so this video is going to speak to everything that I talked about in my workshop, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay. So, oops, sorry. All right, that's it for my presentation. Does anyone have any questions? I hope you enjoyed that video.
Wow, Keenan and Sculpton, and thank you so much, Miranda. That video makes me want to get up and dance right now. And even, learning and listening to the history and what, us Indigenous people have overcome makes me want to get up and dance right now. So thank you so much. We're just honored that you got to spend some time with us this afternoon and bring some of that truth. Truth always comes before reconciliation. So thank you. We have a couple of minutes, everyone. So does anyone have any questions? In the chat box, there's, a lot of thank yous, very powerful video, awesome video. So any questions that you might have, we have about 4 minutes. We'd love to hear from you. So you can come on in, unmute yourself, put it in the chat box, but anyone with any questions or comments? I mean, you left us with a lot to think about and contemplate. I was writing some notes here. The one thing that I didn't know was your last piece, and I wrote it down. It was the two departments, so turning that INAC into Crown Indigenous Relations, Northern Affairs, and Indigenous Services. So now there's two. So did I understand that correctly? There's two
Yeah.
different departments now?
Yes, there's, yeah.
Okay, I did not know that. I'm gonna have to, and I love what you said. Go research, go look into it, make yourself, understand, because there's so much resource out there as well. So that's my takeaway today. I'm gonna research and look into that more. And what does that mean for us as nations, as people? So thank you for that. Well, it doesn't appear that there are any questions at the time. But we're just, again, so honored that you could share a bit of like you said at the very beginning, you're just sharing a little snippet of this history. And so thank you for, opening this world and this understanding for us. And as we go away, may we just go do our own little research. May we go sit with some of those knowledge keepers and listen to the story as well. So a lot of good inspiration today. Sometimes it's hard though to hear that truth. So
I have a question.
Oh yeah, come on in, Tamara.
Hi, Michelle. I was just wondering, the two different departments, how does that affect healthcare for Indigenous people?
Well, it's the same as they just separated the branch, right? Instead of having it one big Indian and Northern Affairs, they just separated them. So one entity will focus on one area, and then Service Canada focuses on a different area, but they're actually all under the same umbrella. So
sorry.
So yeah, so Indigenous Service Canada is who we would probably work with mostly. They always talk about ISC. So a lot of our programs and services would be under that umbrella.
Has there been any sort of like research done to see if the change in this structuring has affected First Nations in any positive or negative ways?
I'm not aware. All I know is that they separated them because of the number of different First Nations that they work with. And one area focuses on the land agreements, like industry, where mining and all of that, right? The Crown, that's why they have the Crown Investment Corporation. So they're more or less focusing on that area when it comes to land and resources and development, right? And then Indigenous Service Canada covers, works with Indigenous groups with programs and services like healthcare.
Okay, thank you for answering my question, and it was a really great presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tamara, for asking the question. Okay, well, that's our hour, everyone. I hope that today was good. The knowledge that was shared was done in a really good way. So thank you so much, Miranda, again, bringing it today. You did great. Thank you. We honor who you are, and we honor, you sharing the teachings and the knowledge.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes. So have a good rest of the day, everyone, and we will see you again soon. Peace.
All right. Bye-bye.